Gaza is basically now almost fully destroyed. What we look at now is that the conflict is actually expanding to the West Bank, and it's causing a lot of disturbances in the economy of the West Bank as well as in Gaza.
Hello, this is the Weekly Tradecast, a podcast brought to you by UN Trade and Development. I'm Sarah Toms. We're exploring how major events are shaping trade and development and how that affects billions of people around the world. This week, we're looking at the latest on the devastating impact of the Israel-Gaza war on the Palestinian economy. On October the 7th last year, Hamas militants launched a deadly assault on Israel, killing about 1,200 people and taking more than 250 hostages. Since then, the response by Israel's military has killed more than 40,000 Palestinians in Gaza. Much of the tiny territory has been reduced to rubble, and most of its 2 million people have been displaced in a humanitarian crisis. The Palestinian economy was already struggling before the war from Israel restrictions, a lack of resources, and a series of crises. But after many months of conflict, a report just released by UN Trade and Development says the economy in Gaza is collapsing and few people have any work. By the middle of this year, Gaza's economy had shrunk to less than 1/6 of its size in 2022. And it's not just Gaza. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem, have felt the impact of the war on trade, tourism and jobs. Rebuilding will demand billions of dollars in aid and investment. Recovery could take many decades. Well, joining me now for more is Rami Alazzeh, an expert in conflict and development economics at UN Trade and Development. Rami studied in Lebanon, the UK and Switzerland and is interested in Middle East politics. He likes reading, taking long walks, stand-up comedy and listening to music. Well, welcome back, Rami.
Thank you, Sarah.
Earlier this year, we talked about the impact of the Gaza-Israeli war on the Palestinian economy. So what does the UN Trade and Development report on the recent developments in the occupied Palestinian territory say about these changes on the ground since then, and what's the outlook ahead?
The new report, or the UNCTAD, is actually now not only looking at Gaza, because after 8 months since we last spoke, things in Gaza has been getting worse. The destruction is now 3.5 times what we saw back in January. Gaza is basically now almost fully destroyed. 2/3 of the structures in Gaza is either destroyed or damaged. Vital civilian infrastructure most of it is now destroyed. Hospitals, schools, universities, basic infrastructure for water, electricity, all of that now in Gaza is destroyed. What we look at now is that the conflict is actually expanding to the West Bank, and it's causing a lot of disturbances in the economy of the West Bank as well as in Gaza. It's the biggest decline in economic activity that the West Bank have seen in decades. It's the highest unemployment that the West Bank have seen since the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. There is the tightening of restrictions in the West Bank, but the severity of what's happening in Gaza is taking the spotlight always. And I think looking ahead, after 11 months of this, people in Gaza also and the international community need to understand that even if the war stops now, there's a lot that needs to be done for recovery to even start, between the rubble, the unexploded bombs in Gaza, which pose a danger to the civilians, but also to the humanitarian working that will start on the recovery in Gaza. In Gaza, when we talk about an economy, it collapsed months ago. The key update we have now is that what's happening in Gaza now is expanding to the West Bank, and we really have to shed the light on what's happening on the West Bank, because it is very dangerous what's happening in the West Bank, and the economy is struggling this year more than any year since the establishment of the Palestinian Authority.
As you said, the death and destruction in Gaza has been a big focus of attention, but tell me a bit more about the impact on the West Bank and what is happening there.
In the past 11 months, the West Bank lost a quarter of its economy. There are more than 300 1,000 jobs that were lost. Unemployment surged to almost 1/3 of the labor force and stands now at 35%. And this is the highest unemployment rate recorded in the West Bank, even higher than the unemployment rate during the Second Intifada between 2000 and 2002, when the Israeli army actually invaded the whole of the West Bank. So what's happening in the West Bank is really serious. The decline in the economic activity in the West Bank is the highest since the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, due to the restrictions of the Israelis, the increase in number of checkpoints, the restrictions on trade, the restriction of the Palestinian Authority to provide services, and the loss of jobs. We really need to shed the light on, because if that continues, we're going to have a much bigger needs for the whole of the occupied Palestinian territory.
So, Rami, in the report you mentioned that Israel, which collects tax for the Palestinian Authority, withholds revenues that provide basic goods and services to people in West Bank and also Gaza. So tell me a little bit about this, and what impact is it having?
Just a little context, basically. Since the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, the Paris Protocol is the framework that governs the economic relation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And it was supposed to be an interim agreement, but 30 years later, it's still the framework governing this economic relation. And in this framework, Israel, since it's controlling all the borders, it collects all the taxes from trade on behalf of the Palestinian Authority and transfer this amount to the Palestinian Authority on a monthly basis. This is what it's called, the clearance revenue. And since last October, the Israelis have been withholding this clearance revenue, which is 2/3 of the Palestinian government's tax revenues. And because of that, the Palestinian Authority has not been able to pay its employees their salaries, to pay the private sector for services provided, and to pay for the poor households the help they desperately need, and especially in the midst of the biggest crisis of the Palestinian economy and for the Palestinian people. The Palestinian government is unable to provide these services. And because of that, the Palestinian Authority have been in severe fiscal crisis and liquidity crisis, adding to the declining in aid from the international community to the Palestinian Authority. So I think this has been compounded the economic issues in the West Bank, given that even the biggest employer of the Palestinian economy, which is the government, cannot pay its employees full salaries.
Now, last time we talked about what needs to happen to get the Palestinian territory back on its feet. How much bigger and more demanding is that recovery now? And what are the immediate priorities and timelines?
The humanitarian crisis is more severe than it was before. What's needed now is the full support to the Palestinian government and its institutions to be able to support fully in the recovery in Gaza and the West Bank. What's needed now is the political pressure to release the withheld Palestinian revenues, which now amounts to over $2 billion, which will solve a lot of the Palestinian Authority's problems. What's needed now, it's a political pressure, and also, once the war ends, for the blockade on Gaza to end as well, for the integration of Gaza and the West Bank under one umbrella in terms of institutions and in terms of economic framework, so the recovery can be faster. Of course, the needs for Gaza now, we're talking way more than the 40 billion mentioned in March. We're talking the time for recovery, even in the best case scenario, it will take decades for Gaza to recover. And in the worst case scenario, if we go back to a place where Gaza is still under blockade, there is no integration with the West Bank, Gaza will take centuries to recover, which means basically Gaza will never recover. And the people there will keep suffering the consequences of the past 11 months for centuries to come. The priorities are clear in terms of development. First is education and health needs to be restored. Kids in Gaza needs to go back to school. The political instability in the West Bank and the violence needs to stop. The support to the Palestinian government, but also to the humanitarian agencies in Gaza, needs to be doubled. And most importantly, this cycle of violence needs to end now. The longer term, I would say, is basically to follow the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, saying that the occupation needs to end and for the Palestinians to have their state in the occupied Palestinian territory, and for the international community to finally push for the two-state solution, because that's the only way where we can have a viable and stable economy for Palestinians.
Thank you so much for that, Rami. Very sobering. That was UN Trade and Development's Rami Alazzeh, who was this week's guest. Tune into the weekly Tradecast next week and every week for more insights on the most pressing issues around the world of trade and development. There's even more on our website, UNCTAD.org. I'm Sarah Toms in Geneva. Goodbye for now.